Hello, my name is John Hebden and I'm a volunteer presenter here at BCB Radio, and this is a one-off half-hour programme to look at the childhoods of the world-renowned Bronte children born and brought up here in Bradford District. At the end of January I had the privilege of going to the Bronte Parsonage Museum in Haworth, just outside Bradford, to find out about their new exhibitions for 2024. I met up with Sue Newby, who is the learning officer at the Parsonage team, and given that the main new exhibition is on childhood, we talked through aspects of the early life of the Bronte children. Sue provided some fascinating insights into how their lives began, and of course she linked that to the new exhibition. And I began by asking Sue about the room in which we were doing the interview, the rather grand Parsonage Library.
It's an old part of the house, but it's not a part the Brontes would have known. So after Patrick's death, a Reverend John Wade took on his role, and he did have a bit more money, so he extended it. So he built this big, lovely room that we use now as our library, but then it was his dining room. Okay. So the Brontes, the home the Brontes knew really wasn't actually very big.
So when you come through the car park towards the museum, it looks enormous, and many times bigger than the original house where the Brontes lived. Yeah,
so if you stand at the front and look, there's a whole gable end extension, and that's where we are now.
Right.
So there's a bit upstairs as well, obviously. And then the museum was so all the bit further back is from the 50s, 70s. Right, okay, sorry, I don't know. Sorry, can you just... Sarah Ross from the modern period. Modern period, I should have just said that, shouldn't I? All the bits there that we use, like when were they built?
Like the shop?
The modern bit, sorry.
60s?
50s.
There's a debate going on amongst the staff team at the moment, and no one seems to be quite sure. You're probably better at knowing the content of the books and the lives of the writers of the books, aren't you? I should think, rather than the architectural developments in the museum.
So basically, it's built as all the kind of extra bits that you would need in a museum. You know, we need office space, we need toilets, we've got a shop. So all that was built later.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, is it owned by? Is there a trust, I guess, that owns the whole thing, that looks after it?
It's a Bronte society, so it's a literary society, and they do own it. Yeah. So it's not. We don't get. We are a charity, but it's not like the National Trust or, we kind of mostly finance ourselves. Really.
I can imagine the Heritage Lottery people being quite happy to support something like this.
We've had grants from various bodies over the years. At the moment, we're a Arts Council portfolio organisation, so we get regular funding from the Arts Council, and that's fantastic. But there's a lot of kind of chasing up grants for specific projects, so it's a kind of an ongoing thing, really. And it's people through the door.
Yeah.
You know, we do rely on visitors and the income we get from visitors.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of visitors, this is a kind of the start of a new season for the museum, isn't it? And you've got some new exhibitions.
Yeah.
So the particular focus on I think the main new exhibition is childhood. So tell us a bit about that exhibition.
Yeah. So we have a little space. It's the last thing that you see really when you look.
Do you want to hold
round when you look around the museum? And it's called the Burnell Room, and every year that changes, so it's quite a lot of work for the curators. And we pick a different theme. Last year it was nature. This year it's childhood, so it's called The Web of Childhood, and it comes from a poem that Charlotte wrote. We wove a web in childhood, so it's exploring their childhood, and we're kind of continuing that theme with other events and things that we'll be doing this year. But that exhibition is where you'll see like the letters. Diaries, artwork, needlework, and most exciting of all, the little books that the Brontes wrote when they were children.
I can ask you
absolutely
about those
phenomenal.
Those sound amazing. Just give us a little bit of a sense of what what childhood was like for the sisters and the brother, because they'd previously been down in Thornton, hadn't they? In their father's business, for want of a better word, moved as he took the parish here in Haworth. So what age were they when they came here?
Anne, the youngest, was just a baby. She was about 5 months old. Charlotte was about 3. So maybe Charlotte had little memories of Thornton, but maybe not. This is where they grew up. And it was a step up for them as far as the house that they were living in. They had quite nice social contacts in Thornton, though, which didn't really happen here. Okay. It's a different kind of place, but also partly because the mother was ill. And she died about a year after they came here.
Oh, right.
So certainly Branwell and Emily would probably not have remembered their mother at all.
So were they kind of having to make their own entertainment a little bit because they'd lost the contacts of other people?
So they were still they were very, very little then. The mother's sister came and helped to look after them. Then all the daughters except for the youngest Anne were sent away to school. It was about 40 miles away, called Cowan Bridge. So it was a charity school. Patrick could just about afford the fees, but schools generally in those days were not pleasant places. They could be very harsh, but this one was particularly punishing and austere, and it was not a happy place at all.
So was that a boarding school?
It was a boarding school.
Okay, so that immediately separated Patrick from his children during term time?
Absolutely, and weeks and weeks and weeks at a time. Emily was only 6. So it must have been incredibly traumatic. But the worst thing that happened was that Mariah and Elizabeth, the 2 eldest girls, contracted tuberculosis and they died as a result of that. So,
what age were they when they died?
They were 11 and 12.
Okay.
So Patrick brought Charlotte and Emily home. And that's when, in some ways, I always think this is when their childhood kind of began. That the childhood we picture of the Brontes growing up here together, writing their little books. So they'd had this awful traumatic time. So Patrick has now got 4 children, and there's no way he's going to send them away.
So did he pull them out of boarding school then?
He did.
And that was...
Yeah, but maybe not as soon as he should have done.
Right.
Well, if your 2 eldest daughters have died and you're not really quite sure how well they were cared for, you are going to do that, I guess. So he brought them home and he taught them himself.
Okay. And that was allowed, was it?
Well, there was no laws about children's education then. You didn't have to give your children any education whatsoever. Right. So it was very patchy, the kind of learning that people got. And of course, generally at the time, girls were not considered to be, needing an awful lot of education.
Just taught to cook and sew, probably, and that was
Cook and sew, and if you were middle class, which the Brontes were middle class, they didn't have a lot of money, but they were middle class, you would be expected to have a certain amount, a certain level of education. For example, it would be expected that girls like the Bronte sisters, if they didn't get married, they would have to go away and be governesses, which is actually what Charlotte and Anne did. So you do need a good education for that. So they'd have to be able to, it'd be nice if they could draw a pretty picture, play some tunes on the piano, maybe learn some French. So have the basics so you could mix in society a little bit. But that could be very basic and superficial. But Patrick knew he got incredibly clever, bright, imaginative children. And he kind of, he was a great reader. So, and he did have quite a few books for the time, and he just kind of let them read whatever, really.
So were Patrick or his wife, did he remarry?
No, he did try. He made a slightly embarrassing attempt. He'd had an engagement years earlier that he'd kind of broken off in slightly kind of odd circumstances. And then when his wife died, he obviously thought, well, it would be nice to have, a companion and some support and so on. And he wrote to her just a very tactless letter, basically, and she wrote quite a scathing letter back, and you can't blame her. So I think he had another little foray, another attempt, but no, and I think he gave up on the idea then and accepted he wasn't going to get married.
Was he or were the girls' mother, were they writers? Were they creative at all?
Patrick did produce some poetry. He actually published it, and he kind of said it was one of the greatest pleasures of his life to write it. But it's kind of written from what you call a didactic. It's like I think the idea, how he justified it to himself was that it's almost like a way of preaching. So there's very strong morals in what he's doing. You wouldn't necessarily recommend it as fantastic poetry. But he loved doing it, and clearly he had some kind of gift. even if it's nothing on the level
what
of the
about
Brontes.
his wife?
Well, she wrote some wonderful letters, and you do feel like they got the talent from somewhere.
Do you think the girls sparked each other off?
Definitely, and the brother. We've not really mentioned Branwell.
Yes.
So because Branwell, he was the only boy, Patrick taught him entirely at home, and if he'd shown any signs of wanting to, he possibly could have gone to university and gone into the church, but he wasn't interested. But anyway, so they were all at home together. Charlotte and Branwell particularly sparked. They were the two older ones, and they all sparked each other off.
Right.
And the story goes, Patrick brought a set of toy soldiers home one day for Branwell. It's a lovely story. He just comes in and puts his head round the door, and I've got these toy soldiers, and it was quite a big deal. They didn't have a lot of toys.
Right.
Nobody did really in those days, particularly. And being so imaginative, kind of any new thing that came into their orbit, they seized on it and used it as a way of making up stories. So they all took one each. They named them after people like the Duke of Wellington, their heroes of the day, and made up little plays about them. And they made an imaginary world that they lived in. And then they started to write the stories down.
They weren't fighting the French then. They were.
They kind of were in their stories. Yeah, they fight all sorts. They fight.
What year are we talking about here? What era in British history?
We're talking about it sort of starts in the mid 1820s, I'd say. So Charlotte was about 11.
The end of the Napoleon.
That was all still very fresh, and Wellington was a massive hero.
Yeah.
I think Bramwell kind of took on the persona of Napoleon. So they loved all that. They loved the drama of it. There wasn't a lot of children's books, so they'd be reading journals and newspapers. Yeah. They liked the conflict in politics. So they kind of got their inspiration from wherever. I mean, it's a childhood that children today would be horrified by, because there was very little in the way of kind of entertainment for them. Not even really children's books very much. So they would have to, use quite adult sources to get the stories from.
Right.
The Bible, Shakespeare, wherever they could get a good story.
So what have you got in the exhibition then? To remember this amazing childhood, this unusual childhood, perhaps.
Yeah, we've got several of the little books, and you really do have to see them to believe them, because they're so tiny. Emily and Anne.
Smaller than a matchbox.
Yes, some of them are.
Branwell and Charlotte in particular.
Yeah, and well, the thing is, Emily and Anne, we don't know what they did because none of theirs has survived.
So they may have done their own little books.
They almost certainly would have done. And we know they all collaborated, especially in the early days, but Charlotte and Branwell kind of veered off a little bit and created this world called Angria.
And these books were for the toy soldiers?
They were for the toy soldiers. Some of them were, yeah.
Okay.
Some of them were for the toy soldiers. So Charlotte wrote...
scaled down to their
Charlotte wrote a
size.
whole series. They're kind of parodies of a magazine they like to read called Blackwoods.
And do they have little stories that you can read?
They have
tiny
contents.
writing?
They have...
That's very clever.
And they really... they're having such fun with it. They kind of send up... Clearly they're reading things in these adult magazines they find a bit pompous, so they send that up.
Okay.
They make up ridiculous pseudonyms, because that is what some people did at the time.
Yeah.
They even have these silly adverts. You get the adverts at the back of journals, kind of promising ridiculous things, So they do that again, but they kind of exaggerate it, sort of. So you'd like to learn to talk to geese? Well, come to this address, and or you want to be an assassin. Or, so they're just having fun with it all, really.
Okay. And you've also got diaries, portraits, school books, and toys, which you said were
we've got
short supply, but you've got some in the exhibition.
We've got a couple of toys in the exhibition upstairs. We've got a very interesting diary, actually, that isn't a Bronte one, because one of the little sections we're looking at is... Haworth, childhood in Haworth, and there were a lot of other children in Haworth as well. And we've got a little diary that was actually somebody who worked in a mill in Keighley, but he was 5. He had a year's education, then he had to go and work in a mill. So the Brontes' childhood can seem really hard. The Brontes' childhoods, and they were in a lot of ways, but you've only got to compare them with, other children a few yards down the street, who would be working incredibly long hours, doing dangerous, boring work in these mills.
Did they not particularly then relate to the other local children because their lives are so different?
I don't think they did really.
No.
I mean, I think Patrick's general attitude was a very compassionate one. He was he had a poor childhood. He knew what it was like to be poor, and he did work for people in Haworth. But there would be a divide really that just kind of couldn't be crossed, I think.
Right.
So they didn't really have people very much at their level like they had done in Thornton.
And did he kind of organise kind of formal lesson times, a sort of school
children?
Day for the kids?
I don't think we know an awful lot about the routine of it. I imagine they would have been, but then he was busy.
He'd have to visit the sick and write
he was. I mean, he
choose his hymns.
He said exactly. Yeah, and he had. He had his own study, and I imagine quite a lot would be shutting the door, and and he said when he got old and he was sick, he said, I used to walk 40 miles a day. Like, where's my strength gone? They didn't have a horse. There were 80 farms in this area that were part of his parish. So he did a heck of a lot of walking.
Seriously, 40
well,
miles a day?
That is what he said. He might have exaggerated a bit. It does a bit, but he would have been, and they all did, They all walked.
And that was part of his job,
yeah, so he was busy.
His pastoral oversight of the parish.
Exactly. So I think the education was fitted in a bit. And then they had their Aunt Bramwell, who'd be making sure... all girls spent a lot of time doing needlework, and we've got some of that in the exhibition.
Right.
Incredibly fine lace work that Charlotte created. Girls had to do samplers. It was usually some kind of religious message and an alphabet all done in tiny cross stitches, just to teach you to be patient, I think, and self-denying and all that kind of thing. So Bramwell was here, so she was a nice secure presence in their life. But she didn't seem to be a particularly inspiring person, but she was there, she was kind, and she saw to all that kind of side of their education. But I think they were left to their own devices quite a bit.
My name is John Hebden, and you're listening to an interview with Sue Newby, the learning officer at the Bronte Parsonage Museum in Haworth. So when did the serious writing start, and when did it seem as though they might get published, and that could be... I guess it was their living, was it?
Not really, no. It was all very, very late on when they, I don't think they have... I think the serious writing started when they were probably about 13.
Yeah.
And they kind of carried on, really, and they created these imaginary worlds that they were still in their early 20s involved in. But I think the idea of it being a way of earning a living, possibly Charlotte always thought about that, because we've got a letter that the poet laureate wrote to her, Robert Southey, obviously in answer to something she'd written to him. So she sent some poems, and he's saying, yes, they're quite nice, but you're never going to make money, you can't. It's not that a woman's life, right? Literature cannot be the work of a woman's life, is what he says. So they had jobs they hated as governesses, teachers.
So was it quite unusual for women to be successful authors?
It wasn't
in the early 19th century.
They've been Jane Austen, who's a successful writer. There've been Anne Radcliffe, who used to write like sensational Gothic novels, who was incredibly popular and successful. So I'm not completely sure where he was coming from with that, but I think maybe it's because she sent in poetry, and poetry was considered at a higher level, in a way, and maybe. Yes, a woman could write a kind of piffling novel, but no, poetry is male preserved. That's real art, So maybe there was a bit of that going on.
Were any of the books published during the girls' lifetime?
Yes, so they each had one. So the three of them wrote a novel at the same time. The first foray into publishing was poetry. So that they did get a book published, and it got good reviews, but terrible sales, and they had to pay for it themselves, completely anonymously, of course. So you've heard of the pseudonyms that they wrote under. Charlotte was Curabell, Emily Alice Bell, Acton Bell. So strange names. Why
did they have to use pseudonyms?
Well, mainly because Emily insisted, because Emily was a deeply private person, really private. And just the idea of people, her poetry was
Didn't
such
want to
a
queue of fans at the
personal.
door.
No, they didn't want people judging them, and it was, she was showing something that was so deeply and
Right.
important to her. It was her
Right.
soul there on the page. So she took some convincing to do it in the first place, but they did it, and her poetry got the best reviews as well. Emily was the best poet. So, but then that they decided that they maybe try a novel. So, and again, we think it was Charlotte that was pushing this, really. But Emily's first novel was Wuthering Heights, and was Agnes Grey. Charlotte was the book called The Professor. They sent them off, they got rejected, they sent them off again. Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey were accepted quite early on. And Charlotte, who'd been, let's do it, hers was rejected. But so Emily and Anne had a publisher, same surname as me, so I don't know whether I'd like to think I was descended from him or not, because he was a bit of a rogue, Newby. So he got there, he said, yes, we'll have them. But he kind of sat on them, didn't really do much. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, Charlotte's sending The Professor, which keeps being rejected. Then one publisher wrote back and said, we've got talent, send us something else. So she sent them Jane Eyre. So Jane Eyre came out first.
Okay.
And then Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey. So they were all alive when those 3 books came out. And then Anne published another book called The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is now considered to be the feminist of the Bronte novels. And
the girls, what age were they when they died? Were they still in their 20s?
No, Emily was 30.
Okay.
Anne was 29.
Yeah.
Charlotte was 38.
And I suppose that was probably not that unusual. Life expectancy in this part of Yorkshire, was it typical, or were they?
If you look around,
die relatively young.
Yeah, well, it was 30 was young even then, but not unusual. If you wander around that churchyard, there's children. Yeah. There's a lot of children. A lot of women in the 20s and 30s dying in childbirth.
Yeah.
But then you see people in the 70s and their 80s.
Did any of the Brontes have any children?
Charlotte was pregnant when she died. In fact, we think that's possibly why why she died. She had a very bad reaction to the pregnancy.
Was she married?
Yes.
To the father of this?
She was out. Yeah. Sorry, just the idea of Charlotte not being pregnant and not being married. She was married, very respectably married to her father's curate, Arthur Bell Nichols.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so she was quite, I suppose, then going quite old to be getting married.
Yeah.
She did seem very contented with Arthur, and I think he was really quite devoted to her. But quite, early in the marriage, became pregnant and then just had a really bad reaction.
I think we've just about covered the whole of the life story
we
of
have.
Brontes, haven't we? And not really talked much about your exhibitions.
No.
So, do you have any of the toy soldiers in the exhibition?
We don't. Unfortunately, we don't have any of them.
Do they still exist somewhere?
No, I don't think so. All we have is a picture that Bramwell drew.
Right.
So we've made reproductions that kind of look like his pictures. We know what they'd have looked like, but none of them have survived.
So you've got a textile installation, and you've got a lady from the northeast of England, Ellie Brennan, and she's been doing some work creating rugs and banners, and there's an exhibition. People can see that as well. Absolutely
beautiful. So there's a kind of a wall hanging, and it's like looking through 2 arched windows into this just really rich. The colours are kind of purples and blues, and it's a bit like looking into an imaginary world almost. But it's all quite abstract, but lovely textures, all at kind of different heights. So very rich. And then there's another one that's in the corner that's kind of going up the wall, and it's on the floor, and they're all greens, like, the mall and the landscape. And then there's a little really kind of intriguing little installation of, it looks like stones, like a dry stone wall, but they're really light, so you can mess around with them and build your own dry stone wall. So it's a great, the landscape's something we've not talked about, but that was such an inspiration to them. It was so important to them. And now he's kind of exploring that. But what's lovely about it is she encourages people to, it's tactile. It's the kind of thing that you want to touch. You might go in a gallery and think, I'd really love to touch that, but I'll probably set off an alarm. But that's what it's for. It's to touch, so you can just feel it, and it's really a lovely piece.
So did the Parsonage Museum, did you commission her to do that?
Yeah, so we work a lot with contemporary artists, and we have done for years now. And we'll kind of give them a brief, but it's usually quite a loose one, so it's up to them to respond. And we've had amazing things over the years that have been created.
So when I came to your front door about half an hour ago, I was surprised to see that it was locked. But usually I think you're open on a Wednesday. So you're off season at the moment. When does your season start, and when are tourists welcome again?
It starts tomorrow.
Oh, tomorrow.
1st of February. Yeah, so bang on. So we're always closed in January, and we do make lots of changes, and that kind of thing. And then we open up on the 1st of February, 10 till 5. And we're open Wednesday to Sunday. So we're closed Monday and Tuesday at the moment. And yes, everybody's welcome.
So apart from the exhibitions, there's the old house as well, and is that's all set up as it was when the Brontes lived here, is it? Yeah,
so we have a room. You come in through the front door, and then you've got Patrick's study, Mr. Bronte's study on the right. You've got the dining room on the left, and then you've got the kitchen, and they're all. But we have got a great collection here. So when you look around, you're mostly seeing their things, not the kind of things we think they'd have. It's their things. Yeah. So that's not the books, but most of the things are. We've got the piano that they had, and so on. So it's an amazing place. Yeah. You really get a sense of life in the house. And then some of the other rooms are a bit different. You go upstairs. We've got, for example, one of the big bedrooms. We don't really have anything that would go in it. So that's an exhibition space. Charlotte's room, we call it, servant room. We often put contemporary art things in there. But then Patrick's room, we've tried to make that look as we think it would have been. Okay. A really interesting, different room in the museum is Bramwell's studio. So it used to be just a room where we put some of Bramwell's artwork, because he was an artist. Right. He did earn his living as an artist.
He was a painter.
Yeah.
And a writer.
They were all artists.
Okay.
But he earned his living as a painter.
Oh, okay.
It was much harder for women to do that. But but the room now, it's much more. It really looks like you would imagine Bramwell's room to look. There's no sanitised, because it's a museum, but none of the things are original. So there was a film written by Sally Wainwright a few years ago now, and I can't remember the exact year, but it was called To Walk Invisible.
That's as in Happy Valley, Sally Wainwright.
Yeah, that's Sally Wainwright. It's amazing. It's wonderful. And we worked with different creative partners over the years, and we worked with Simon Armitage on Bramwell's 200th anniversary, and his idea was to use Bramwell's room as it was in the set and to put it into the museum, because you get a sense of the chaos that was going on in his mind and his life, and it's really out of control, and so you get a very different feeling in that room.
And that was Sue Newby, the Learning Officer at the Bronte Parsonage Museum in Haworth. And do get along if you can to see the childhood exhibition and the rug installations at the museum. Thanks very much to Sue for her time. And here's a little bit more of the unthanks, singing Emily Bronte's poetry with the Bronte piano, recorded actually in the Haworth Parsonage.
Few hearts to mortals given, on earth so wildly pine, yet few would ask a heaven more like this earth than thine. Then let my wings caress thee, thy comrade let me be, since naught beside can bless thee. Return and dwell with